Hello, everybody. My name is Greg Nooney. I gave this sermon on Palm Sunday on April 12, 2025 at the First Unitarian Church in Sioux City, Iowa. I'm repeating it today because it was not recorded at the time due to human error. The title of the sermon is The Evolution of God in the Old Testament. Unitarian Universalism draws from 6 sources. The fourth listed is the following: Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Today is Palm Sunday. This is the day when Christians celebrate the story of Jesus triumphantly riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. The people were elated. They called him king. For some reason, they also spread their cloaks on the road. They waved palm branches back and forth. They shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel." This was a fulfillment of the prophecy in Zechariah, quote, "Your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey." The fulfilling of prophecies was very important to the gospel writers as a way to link the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, to their stories of Jesus, and as a way to prove that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. As another example, after the hosannas, according to Matthew and Luke, with all the support of the people, he entered the temple and drove out the merchants in order to fulfill another prophecy in Jeremiah, quote, "Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you?" If Jesus acted in order to fulfill a prophecy, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I hardly think it can then be used as a proof that Jesus is the Messiah. Since these Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death and were based on oral accounts, it seems likely, in my view, that the stories were shaped as a way to fulfill the prophecies rather than the other way around. I was critical of this in my sermon in January when I emphasized how Jesus of Nazareth was a Jewish man of his times. As an aside, according to Mark, after the parade, Jesus did not disrupt the temple. He entered the temple courts, looked around, and apparently he was too late, so he traveled to Bethany instead. The next day, however, he walked by a fig tree. He was hungry, but there were no figs, so he cursed the tree, and it withered. What I didn't understand, which I plan to pay attention to in this sermon, is how the gospel writers' focus on the prophets served another purpose. It provided a way to use those traditions to argue a widening of God's mercy and inclusiveness. I plan a 2-part sermon. Today we will explore the ways in which the Old Testament tells the story of the evolution of Yahweh. Next week I will explore how the New Testament does the same. In both cases, I am drawing heavily from a book entitled The Widening of God's Mercy by the father and son team Christopher and Richard Hayes, with a few references to Carl Jung's seminal essay, Answer to Job. The Hayes argue conclusively, in my view, for the full inclusion of LGBTQIA2S+ folks, or as they call them, sexual minorities, into the Christian tent, based on their reading of Scripture. There are several scriptural citations that seem to refer to homosexuality and to condemn it. These have been used by Christians and by many Christian churches to condemn not only the acts, but also the persons involved in such sexual actions. There are 2 strong arguments against doing this. Number 1, there are numerous citations in the Bible that we no longer pay attention to, such as women needing to cover their heads in church, the justification of slavery, and stoning women who commit adultery. The few references to homosexuality should also be ignored. Number 2, diving into the actual citations reveals something quite different. There was no cultural sense of sexual orientation at the time these statements were written down. There was certainly no concept of a mutually loving same-sex relationship, nor, for that matter, no concept of a mutually loving equal opposite-sex relationship. Instead, the foundation upon which sexual prescriptions were made was the notion of social hierarchy and power. Males were at the top of the hierarchy, and the consent of female recipients of sexual acts was never a consideration. By this measure, what was condemned in Leviticus, when addressing male-to-male intercourse, was that males should not give up their power position in the hierarchy by becoming the passive recipient of a sexual act. Today, we reject the hierarchical foundational understandings, and so should also reject the idea of condemning homosexual acts. I find these two arguments persuasive, but the Hayes offer a third, much more comprehensive one, whereby they maintain that sexual minorities should be welcomed into the Christian community because God has evolved, that he no longer would want to exclude them. Even if there is no scripture that explicitly says to do so, it is our responsibility to widen our sense of empathy and maintain a welcoming stance, because we can be confident the newly evolved God would want us to. I should begin by countering the often repeated and firmly believed idea that God is immovable. If he is perfect, how could he reconsider his choices? How could he change his mind? There are several scriptural quotes that support this view. For example, in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 8, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever." In Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, "I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed." And in Paul's letter to the Hebrews, chapter 13, verse 8, "Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever." And in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 29, "The glory of Israel does not recant or change his mind. He is not a mortal that he could change his mind." Only 6 verses after this statement is the following: "And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel." In other words, he did change his mind. The reality of the scriptures is that Yahweh changes his mind over and over again. He is anything but unchangeable. If we desire to honor the text, we must accept this. The Hayes note multiple examples of Yahweh changing his mind from a rigid, tightening stance to a more inclusive, loosening one. He starts with a closely defined, chosen people, but slowly widens that definition to eventually include the entire human race. Another example that is often unnoticed in the second creation story, the story of Adam and Eve, God says in no uncertain terms as follows, quote, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, "You shall not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for the day that you eat of it, you shall die." What happened when they ate of it? Did they die that day? No, they did not. Why did they not die that day? God changed his mind. He even, quote, "made garments of skins for the man and for his wife, and clothed them." When Cain kills Abel, God ignores his own commandment in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, quote, "Whoever sheds the blood of a human by a human, shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind." he should have told Abel to execute Cain, or actually tell somehow that Cain should have been executed, or perhaps Yahweh should have slain him himself, but he did not. Instead, he sent Cain into exile. Cain then complains that he could easily be killed by others. So what does God do? He places a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Kind of a get out of getting murdered free card. As an aside, this citation also contradicts the Garden of Eden story, whereby Adam and Eve are identified as the first humans. Eve gave birth to their firstborn sons, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and Cain is exiled. Why is he worried about being attacked by other humans? Where did all these other tribes of folks come from? The only solution to this problem is to realize that there is a third creation story, whereby many groups of humans are created by God. In the beginning of the Old Testament, Yahweh is depicted as a jealous, vindictive God. There is little evidence of him being a loving God toward his creatures. In fact, he narrows the focus of his energy toward humankind to a small group of his chosen people, disregarding all others as irrelevant at best and enemies to be slaughtered at worst. But even then, his behavior toward his chosen people left much to be desired. For example, when Moses brought down the tablets with the Ten Commandments and found the people had erected a golden calf to worship, Moses gathered the Levites, who had not participated in the rituals, and told them, quote, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Each man strap a sword to his side. Go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor." The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. Then Moses said, "You have been set apart to the Lord today, for you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day." That's from Exodus chapter 32, verse 27 to 30. This didn't quite satisfy Yahweh, so, quote, "The Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made, where presumably thousands more died." Exodus chapter 32, verse 35. He then instructs the Israelites to go to the promised land, and he will send an angel ahead of them to, quote, "drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites." Exodus chapter 32, verse 2. There are numerous examples like this, and some even worse. It is clear to me that if any book should be banned from the tender minds of our children, the Old Testament of the Bible should be at the top of the list. There are too many awful stories to list in this sermon. I will recount another one, which has to do with child sacrifice. We all know the story of God ordering Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, then stopping him at the last minute, testing him apparently to make sure he would obey God, even if it was a terrible thing to do. Absolute obedience, absolute loyalty. Even military officers in this country are forbidden to carry out an unlawful order. In Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 25 to 26, God admitted that he had given the Israelites, quote, "statutes that were not good and laws through which they could not live." He admitted he commanded the Israelites to sacrifice their firstborn children to him so that, quote, "I might fill them with horror so they would know that I am the Lord," unquote. Later in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 35, he denies that he ever ordered it. Quote, "They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to offer up their daughters and sons to Molech, though I did not command them, nor did it enter my mind that they should do this abomination, causing Judah to sin. Okay, what do we make of this? Yahweh ordered the Israelites to sacrifice their firstborn children, that is, to burn them like they might burn a handful of grain or a dove as a sacrifice to pay homage to their God. Then later, he changes his mind, says don't do it, and denies that he ever ordered it. He calls such an action an abomination and says, quote, it never entered his mind. Another example is a story about an Israelite by the name of Phinehas, and is told in the 25th chapter of Numbers. Yahweh was angry at the Israelites because some of them got involved with Moabite women and gave homage to their god Baal. So he sent a plague that killed 24,000 Israelites. Apparently, Yahweh had a particular hatred of Baal. He finally stopped the plague when Phinehas stepped into the tent of an Israelite named Zimri, who was having sex with Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of Midianite family. Phinehas drove his spear through the stomachs of Zimri and Cosbi. Due to the zealousness of Phinehas, Yahweh stopped the plague and praised Phinehas and promised that he and his descendants would have a covenant of lasting priesthood. God starts out strict, vindictive, and rigid. Then when he sees humans suffering, or when they make a decent argument, he relents and shows mercy. Another example is Noah. God planned to destroy the entire human race, but Noah argued over and over to allow some humans to live, and God changed his mind. Instead of completely destroying all humans, God saves Noah and his extended family, and as many other critters he can fit in the ark. Those of us who are parents have probably done something similar. Your child does something awful, and in the spur of the moment you ground them for a month. Then, after 4 or 5 days, you see how sorry they are, how much they are suffering, and you relent. You realize not that the grounding was unnecessary, but that the number of days was excessive. There are numerous other examples. Abraham, Jonah, Moses, and many others have arguments with God where they challenge him, beg him, implore him to change his mind, and oftentimes he does. More often than not, when he does change his mind, he moves along that trajectory toward mercy, toward inclusiveness. As I view the many stories of Yahweh promising excessive punishment, then relenting and exerting a lesser punishment, or even at times repenting of his wrath, I am reminded of the classic narcissistic domestic abuser. He beats his wife in a moment of anger, then says he is sorry and expects to be forgiven. She is understandably frightened and accepts his apology, trying to put out of her mind the idea that he is likely to do it again. On the other hand, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the idea that an all-powerful being has the capacity to show any mercy at all is pretty amazing. Christopher and Richard Hayes argue, persuasively in my opinion, that Yahweh changes. It is a slow process. He is a bit hard-headed, but when humans argue with him and remind him that he is supposed to be merciful, he often changes his mind. What is significant in the Hayes work is that they are providing a solid argument for the evolution of God's mercy, and they are specifically applying this idea to sexuality. Since God has slowly developed the capacity to include more and more humans into his fold, so it is reasonable to also include LGBTQAI2S+, as well as gender nonconforming folks. Unlike the Hayes, however, I don't actually believe that this all-powerful God exists. I am more impressed with the idea that the story of God changes as humans develop compassion and care for each other. This gives me some hope, when hope is hard to find. This may be welcome news for Christians who have been taught that God is a loving God, and yet wonder why they must fear him. For those of us who are not Christians, who do not believe that Yahweh exists in some immortal realm, what possible relevance does this have? Bear with me and I will attempt to answer this. Carl Jung notes that he has been asked many times if he believes in the existence of God, and he writes this, quote, "What most people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche as real. God is an obvious, non-physical fact. That is, a fact that can be established psychically, but not physically." This is from Jung's book called Answer to Job, page 101 to 102. My second resource is Carl Jung's seminal essay, Answer to Job. He explains how Yahweh made a bet with Satan that his servant Job would not curse him, even if he endured great suffering. Subsequently, he allowed Satan to torture Job, without even a glimmer of empathy toward Job. Yahweh's cruelty is a manifestation of his shadow side. At this point, he is aligned with Satan and cares more about Satan than he does about humans. After diminishing Job to a bet between himself and one of the sons of God, the Satan, that is, the adversary, what today we call the devil's advocate, and allowing the worst kind of torture to his loyal servant who did absolutely nothing wrong, and killing off his wife and kiddos, God did finally relent and gave Job a new wife and new kiddos and new riches. Carl Jung argued that it was Job who reminded God that he was supposed to be merciful and ethical, and Job's arguments influenced God, and that was why he decided to send his son to be crucified in order to atone for the unfair way he treated Job. Jung makes a powerful argument that the Yahweh we meet in the Old Testament, who is described as omniscient and good, must have exiled from his awareness his capacity to love his creations. Instead, he operates from his shadow self and exudes the worst of what today we call toxic masculinity. As a non-Christian, I look at it this way. God was created by humans, and one very powerful set of stories about God is contained in the Bible. In those stories, God evolves from vindictive to eventually, as Jesus describes him, as a loving father. Jung would argue that God starts out unconscious, living out his shadow parts of anger, jealousy, pride, selfishness, and greed. Slowly, his better angels, if you will, start manifesting. If this God was created by humans, then it is humans who, over the centuries, have developed empathy, compassion, and ethics. As we evolved and became more conscious and ethical, we naturally attributed these more compassionate and loving attributes to the Godhead. It is not unlike the proposition promoted by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that, quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice."